Imagine this. Scientists are exploring a remote, impossibly deep cave system in Siberia. They go deeper than anyone has ever gone before, and they're cut off from the world for thousands of years. They find a small, thriving population of people. But they aren't us. They're shorter, stockier, they have pronounced brow ridges and wide noses. They are Neanderthals, and they are alive. The world would stop. Everything we thought we knew about ourselves would be thrown into question. For the first few months, it would be a purely scientific spectacle, a quarantine zone. Geneticists, anthropologists, and linguists would have a field day. We'd learn more about human evolution in a year than we have in the last 2 centuries. But eventually, the real question would have to be answered. What happens now? The first and biggest fight would be about personhood. Are they human? It seems like an obvious yes, but our legal systems are built for one kind of human. In Homo sapiens, the debate would be fierce. Corporations would see them as a resource, a potential source of unique genetic material, or a curiosity to be studied. Some religious groups might see them as soulless beings, an evolutionary dead end that was never meant to be. Others would see them as another of God's creations, deserving of protection. The legal battle would be the defining moment of the 21st century. It would dwarf every previous civil rights struggle. Activist groups would form overnight. Neanderthal Rights Now would be a protest slogan. The case would eventually land in the highest courts of the world. The verdict would have to be yes. They are people, they are a sister species, but they are sentient, they feel pain. They form bonds, they have families. To deny them rights would be to commit a crime against humanity itself. So they get rights, they are citizens. What does that even mean for them? They can't just be released into modern society. They have no immunity to our diseases. A common cold could wipe them out. For the first generation, they would likely live in a protected, isolated community, a sort of modern reservation. It would be a place where they could slowly acclimate, with medical teams on standby. A place where their culture, whatever it is, could be preserved. But their children would be different. They would be born into our world. They would grow up seeing our technology, hearing our languages, watching our television. This is where society would truly begin to change. Let's start with the physical. A Neanderthal is not a brutish caveman. That's a myth. But they are physically different. They are incredibly strong. Their bone density is much higher than ours. Their bodies are built for power and endurance in the cold. An average Neanderthal male could probably outperform our most elite powerlifters without even trying. This would change sports completely. Would we have separate leagues? A Neanderthal football league would be a terrifying, brutal spectacle. Track and field, wrestling, boxing, any sport based on raw power would be dominated by them. It would force us to ask what sports are for. Are they a measure of ultimate human potential, or just the potential of Homo sapiens? Maybe new sports would be invented, sports that play to their specific strengths. Their physical presence would also change the nature of work. In an age of automation, we often think manual labor is obsolete. But it's not. There are still jobs that require a strong back. Construction, disaster relief, logging, deep-sea fishing. And Neanderthals would excel at this work. But this is also a trap. It would be too easy to stereotype them as nothing more than manual laborers. To see them as strong but dumb. This would create a new kind of class system, one based on species. We would have to fight against the urge to exploit their physical gifts while ignoring their minds. And what about their minds? Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. But they were shaped differently. The frontal lobes associated with things like social networking and complex planning were smaller. Their occipital lobes, for visual processing, were larger. This doesn't mean they were less intelligent. It means they were intelligent in a different way. They might be visual thinkers. They might see patterns we miss. They might be able to mentally rotate and manipulate objects in 3 dimensions with an ease that we would find astonishing. Imagine a Neanderthal architect or engineer. They might not write a 50-page proposal, but they could build a virtual model in their head and then just... Our education system would be a disaster for them. It's designed for sapiens children. It's based on sitting still, abstract language, and long-term multi-step planning. A Neanderthal child might find this environment maddening. They might be seen as having a learning disability, when in reality they just learn differently. We would need to create entirely new educational models. Schools that are more hands-on, more visual, more focused on learning by doing. If we failed to do this, we would be condemning an entire species to the bottom of the social ladder. And then there's the social aspect. How would we get along? Neanderthals lived in small, tight-knit family groups. Their social circles were likely much smaller than ours. The idea of a city with millions of people might be overwhelming for them. The constant noise, the sea of unfamiliar faces, it could lead to intense social anxiety. They might prefer to live in smaller towns or form their own communities on the outskirts of big cities, enclaves where the pace of life is slower and they are surrounded by familiar faces. And prejudice would be a huge problem. It's unavoidable. We are already terrible to each other based on skin color or country of origin. Now imagine a different species. The slurs would start immediately. They'd be called brutes, cavemen, subhumans. There would be fear. A Neanderthal is physically intimidating. A lone Neanderthal walking down the street at night would cause people to cross to the other side, and there would be violence. Hate crimes would be a sad new reality. The media would play a huge role in this. Some outlets would sensationalize every crime committed by a Neanderthal, creating a narrative of fear. Others would champion their cause, perhaps to the point of romanticizing them. We'd see them in movies and TV shows. At first, they'd be crude stereotypes. The big, dumb sidekick, the silent, noble savage, but over time, more nuanced portrayals would emerge. We'd see Neanderthal families, Neanderthal artists, Neanderthal scientists. Pop culture would be the battleground for their public image. Their existence would also force us to look in the mirror. Our own definition of humanity would be stretched. For centuries, many cultures have seen Homo sapiens as the pinnacle of creation, the only truly intelligent life on Earth. That idea would be shattered. We would no longer be alone. This would be a profound philosophical and religious shock. Some would see it as a humbling experience, a chance to broaden our compassion. Others would feel threatened, their sense of specialness eroded. Let's think about medicine. We know that many modern humans have a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. This is from interbreeding that happened tens of thousands of years ago. That DNA affects things like our immune system and our susceptibility to certain diseases. Having a living population of pure Neanderthals would be a medical revolution. By studying their immune systems, we could learn how they fought off ancient viruses and bacteria. This could lead to new vaccines and antibiotics. They would likely be immune to some of our most common ailments while being terrifyingly vulnerable to others. We could also study their genetics to better understand diseases that have a Neanderthal link, like diabetes and Crohn's disease. But this brings up enormous ethical questions. Would we treat them as patients or as research subjects? The temptation to exploit them for medical gain would be immense. Pharmaceutical companies would be lining up to get blood samples and genetic sequences. There would need to be incredibly strict laws to protect them, to ensure that they are participants in medical research, not just resources for it. What about their own culture? In the Siberian cave, they would have had 40,000 years of uninterrupted cultural evolution. They would have their own languages. It would probably be very different from ours. Given their anatomy, it might have a different range of sounds. Maybe it would be more tonal or incorporate more nonverbal cues. Linguists would spend their entire lives trying to understand it. They would have their own stories, their own myths, their own understanding of the universe. What do they believe about life and death? Do they have a religion? We have found evidence that Neanderthals buried their dead, sometimes with grave goods. This suggests they had some concept of an afterlife, some form of spirituality. To be able to ask them about it would be incredible. It would be like opening a direct window into the deep past. We would have to work hard to preserve this culture. When their children start going to our schools and watching our media, they would inevitably start to assimilate. Their ancestral language would be replaced by English or Mandarin. Their ancient stories would be replaced by superhero movies. Within a few generations, their unique culture could be gone forever. It would be an extinction of a different kind. Then there is the question of family and relationships. Could a Neanderthal and a sapiens fall in love? Of course. Could they have children? The science says yes. We already have the proof in our own DNA. But the social implications would be massive. The children would be hybrids, a bridge between two worlds. They would belong to both species and to neither. They would face their own unique form of prejudice. Where would they fit in? Their existence would ripple through every part of our society. The arts would change. A Neanderthal artist might create things we find both alien and deeply familiar. Their visual acuity could lead to forms of hyper-realistic painting or sculpture that boggle the mind. Their music might use scales and rhythms that our ears aren't accustomed to, but that convey deep emotion. Our technology might change too. We design things for sapiens hands, sapiens bodies, sapiens minds. A phone might be difficult for a Neanderthal's thick fingers to operate. A car seat would be uncomfortable for their different frame. A user interface on a computer might be completely unintuitive to their way of thinking. A new field of Neanderthal ergonomics would emerge, designing tools and technology that work for them. In the long run, what would happen? Would they assimilate completely, their DNA slowly mixing back into the human gene pool until they are no longer a distinct group? This happened once before, or would they maintain their own communities, a distinct and permanent minority group within the larger human family? Perhaps the most profound change would be to our own sense of self. For our entire history, we have been humanity, the sole occupants of that title. But with Neanderthals among us, we would have to start saying Homo sapiens. We would be one of two human species on the planet. This would force us to be more specific, more humble. We would learn so much about our own evolution, our own strengths and weaknesses, by seeing a different model of humanity living alongside us. We would see that our way of thinking, our social structures, our very definition of intelligence is just one possible path that evolution could have taken. They would not be a lesser version of us. They would be a different version of us. A parallel path. Their presence would be a constant, living reminder of where we came from. It would make the deep past feel immediate and real. Visiting a Neanderthal community would be like stepping back in time. But it would also be a vision of a possible future, one where humanity is defined not by a single species, but by a family of species. Of course, this is an optimistic view. The reality would likely be much messier. There would be exploitation, racism, and violence. There would be political opportunists who would use fear of Neanderthals to gain power. There would be ghettos and inequality. We would fail them in many of the same ways we have failed each other. But there would also be love, friendship, and collaboration. There would be sapiens who dedicate their lives to fighting for Neanderthal rights. There would be hybrid children who grow up to be leaders and bridge the gap between their two peoples. There would be shared moments of discovery and creation. The arrival of Neanderthals wouldn't just be about them adapting to our world. It would be about us adapting to a new reality, a reality where we are not the only ones. It would be a challenge. It would be a test of our compassion, our tolerance, and our wisdom. It would hold up a mirror and ask us what it truly means to be human. The answer would be more complex and hopefully more beautiful than we ever imagined. Their daily lives would be a constant negotiation. A Neanderthal going to the grocery store would be a mundane event that is also deeply political. The way people stare. The cashier who speaks slowly to them as if they are a child. The assumption that they are there to buy simple, raw foods. Every interaction would be tinged with the weight of being different. Think about language barriers. Even if a Neanderthal learned English, their accent might be thick due to the different structure of their vocal tract. They might have a different cadence, a different way of expressing emotion. Our reliance on subtle vocal cues and conversation might be lost on them, and their reliance on perhaps more visual or gestural cues might be lost on us. Communication would be a constant effort. Their relationship with nature might also be different. Having evolved in close contact with the wild for hundreds of thousands of years, they might feel a profound sense of loss in our concrete cities. They might be the greatest conservationists the world has ever seen. They might understand ecosystems in an intuitive way that our data-driven science is only now beginning to grasp. A Neanderthal park ranger would know the forest not as a collection of resources, but as a living entity. And what about the little things? Their diet would be different. They were apex predators, adapted to a high-protein diet. Our modern processed foods, full of sugar and carbohydrates, might be terrible for their health. This would create a niche market for Neanderthal-specific foods. It would also lead to health disparities, as poor Neanderthals might only be able to afford the unhealthy sapiens food. Their sense of smell might be more acute. Our cities, with their pollution and artificial scents, might be a constant assault on their senses. They might be able to smell fear or sickness on a person. This could make them seem almost supernatural to us, further alienating them. The political landscape would shift. A Neanderthal vote would become a powerful bloc in some regions. Politicians would have to start addressing their specific needs: access to healthcare, education reform, housing discrimination. These would become Neanderthal issues. Some Neanderthals would become politicians themselves, bringing a completely new perspective to the halls of power. Imagine a Neanderthal senator arguing for environmental policy, not from a place of abstract science, but from a deep instinctual understanding of the natural world. The military would be interested in them. Their strength, their resilience to pain and cold would make them ideal soldiers in some ways. But their psychology might be all wrong for a modern army. Their loyalty is to the small family group, not to an abstract concept like a nation. They might not be able to follow the kinds of orders that a modern war requires. The ethics of recruiting a different species to fight our wars would be a minefield. We'd also have to confront our own past. The fact that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals coexisted for thousands of years, and then they vanished, would no longer be an abstract historical fact. We would have to wonder, did we kill them off? Did we outcompete them? Did we give them diseases? The guilt of a potential prehistoric genocide would hang over our relationship with them. It would add a layer of responsibility, a sense that we owe them something. In the end, their presence would enrich us in ways we can't even predict. They would be a living link to a world we have lost. A world with megafauna and vast, untouched wilderness. A world where human had a broader meaning. They would force us to be better. By having to define their rights, we would be forced to better define our own. By having to understand their minds, we would learn more about the potential of our own. Their existence would be the ultimate refutation of bigotry. It would show that there is more than one way to be a person. Intelligence is not a single linear scale. Culture is not a monolith. The human family is more diverse than we ever knew. It would be a difficult and often painful transition. There would be setbacks. But ultimately, society would be bigger, more complex, and more interesting. We would lose our evolutionary loneliness. We would gain brothers and sisters. The world would feel older, deeper, and more mysterious, and we, Homo sapiens, would finally have to grow up and learn to share the planet. The change would be total, it would be profound, and it would be permanent. We would never see ourselves or our place in the universe the same way again.